Good evening, folks. This night we drift gently into the soft, scratchy folds of the medieval marriage market, a strange and creaky contraption powered by whispers, wool, and the occasional loaf of rye. The air is thick with wood smoke and barley stew. A candle flickers in the corner, its light bouncing off a pewter plate with one dent too many. Someone nearby is loudly sharpening a goose. You probably would not choose this as the most romantic setting for lifelong commitment, but here we are. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments what time it is and where you are tuning in from. It is always a delight to see who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, let the fan murmur, and let's ease into this night's delightful journey together. It begins with a bundle, not of flowers, not of nervous joy, but of linens, dried meats, and a goat that stares slightly to the left of reality. That is your dowry starter pack. In many medieval towns, a woman's marriage prospects were closely tied to the exact volume of her bundle. 5 sheets meant she might marry a journeyman cooper. 7, a slightly tipsy clerk with dreams of owning 2 hats. 11, and she might catch the attention of a minor knight with dental regrets. The numbers varied wildly, but the implication remained constant. Marriage was less about feelings and more about assets, and whether those assets included enough linen to wrap 3 dead monks. By the 13th century, the church had begun mandating public announcements before weddings, called banns. These were read aloud on 3 consecutive Sundays in case anyone wanted to object or remember they were already married. This practice often caused a brief uptick in frantic travel, quiet bribes, and declarations like, No, it was a different Thomas with a crooked ear." The idea was to prevent accidental bigamy. The result was more often a well-informed crowd and fewer surprise weddings. Nothing says romance quite like a priest loudly listing your name next to a surname no one can pronounce, followed by a lengthy silence and one man in the back coughing with judgment. Bread prices, strangely enough, played their own meddling role. During lean years, when loaves shrank and bakers wept softly into their flour, families delayed marriage arrangements. Weddings were costly. There were feasts to host, shoes to borrow, and somewhere a man who charged 6 turnips just to play the sackbut out of tune. Thus poor harvests directly impacted whether Gertrude ever got to marry the Thatcher's son. Economists rarely study this, possibly because they fear medieval bread inflation is too depressing to quantify. Your hypothetical self standing in this imaginary village might be of marrying age. That is to say, not currently betrothed, not a priest, and not dead, which frankly narrows the pool significantly. At the weekly market, your presence is noted. You walk past a stand of onions with studied nonchalance. There is a rustle from the cloth merchant's tent. A widow eyes your belt quality with quiet disdain. She knows the signs, so does her nephew. He adjusts his hat, an important gesture in the mating ritual, and asks about your family's barley yield this year. You reply, as everyone does, with an answer that sounds honest but reveals nothing. Historians still argue whether bans were genuinely effective at preventing unsuitable marriages, or if they merely provided good gossip material for people who had not seen a new face in 8 months. One theory suggests the whole process was less about protecting the sanctity of union and more about reminding everyone in earshot that a specific person was, tragically, about to be legally joined with someone else forever. Possibly someone who smelled of hay mold and called soup water meat. The fringes of belief bring us to one strange little ritual documented in only a few regional pockets: the spindle offering. In this practice, a prospective bride would leave a decorated spindle, painted red, wrapped in blue thread, at the doorstep of a family she hoped to marry into. If it remained by morning, the proposal was rejected. If it was taken inside, talks would begin. If it was returned, tied with a sprig of garlic, it meant someone had misunderstood entirely, and it was best to move far away. No one truly knows how widespread this was. One chronicler from Devonshire describes it earnestly, another calls it rural nonsense best left to cows, and cows, as it happens, could influence a marriage. If your family had one that could walk in a straight line and did not eat fence posts, your dowry could be bumped by several chickens. It is easy now to scoff, lying beneath a polyester comforter in an age when people swipe left on entire humans. But then back then, a good cow was better than a good conversation. No one ever asked a cow for her views on the harvest tithe. Weddings, when they occurred, were elaborate affairs involving no small amount of logistics and strategic grumbling. In most places, there was no requirement for a priest to be present, only witnesses. A couple could, in theory, marry themselves with mutual consent, which is perhaps why so many noble families insisted on as many onlookers as possible. The more people heard you say, "I do," the harder it was to later claim, "I did not mean it like that." There were market calendars filled with potential matchmaking opportunities, harvest fairs, saints' days, and the less romantic but more frequently attended pig tax levies. All were chances to mingle, stare longingly at someone's cloak stitching, and hope that your uncle was not loudly explaining your bloodline to strangers again. These were the romantic arenas of the time. They reeked of sweat, sausages, and damp wool. One document from 1351 describes a man who proposed marriage over a wheel of cheese. He presented it dramatically, wrapped in a strip of woven goat hair ribbon, and said something likely meant to be poetic, but was lost to history, and also possibly the cheese. The marriage never occurred. She married a man who made boots instead. His proposal involved no cheese, but several pairs of practical footwear. A better deal, arguably. Some marriages were arranged before either party could form opinions, which made things easier. Others were arranged despite those opinions, which made things more like an outdoor chess match during a hailstorm. "You will marry the miller's daughter," a father might declare, "because she owns a mule and does not cry during thunderstorms," but was not absent, necessarily. It was just scheduled to arrive later, quietly, once everyone stopped mentioning the dowry. In the corner of the market square, a raven watches from the butcher's overhang. Its eye catches the sun just briefly. No one seems to notice. Back to the matter of bread, one chronicler notes that in 1328 a sudden rise in rye prices caused the postponement of 10 weddings in a single parish. The priest recorded this with evident irritation, noting that he had already dusted his wedding stole and had no use for it during regular sermons. He went on to blame bakers, sin, and possibly Lutherans, though Luther had not yet been born. Such were the priorities of the time. Women, often having little say in marriage arrangements, used the only tools at their disposal: whispers, shawl colour choices, and fainting strategically near eligible bachelors. It rarely worked, but sometimes it created just enough social confusion to stall negotiations. One woman famously fainted so often that her father assumed illness and cancelled the wedding. She married someone else 3 months later with noticeably better eyebrows. So it was in the labyrinth of wool, bands, and barley that marriages were made. Not in heaven, certainly. Possibly in a damp shed beside a leaky ale barrel during a feast where someone brought fish pie again and everyone pretended to enjoy it. There is a kind of hush that settles over a weaving hall when someone drops a sheep proposal. Not metaphorically, a literal sheep, trussed with ribbon and led awkwardly by a squire who may or may not be sober. He clears his throat, names his family line back 5 generations, and presents the animal as proof of both affection and solvency. The sheep blinks, the crowd waits, the girl's uncle nods. A marriage has begun. Of course, it was not always sheep. Sometimes it was socks, hand-knit, woolen, practical socks, though the term sock in medieval usage was a bit generous. They were more like vaguely foot-shaped tubes with ambitions, but to receive a pair, especially in spring, meant someone somewhere had been thinking about your calves in the most tax-compliant way. If the socks matched, even better. If they fit, it bordered on scandalous. Some towns took it seriously enough to have gift registries, albeit carved on oak boards and mostly concerning livestock, blankets, and who owed whom for last year's barley incident. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not a single event. It was a process, a slow accretion of gestures, nods, silences, and relatives inexplicably carrying poultry. It might begin with a word passed across a fence post, a glance traded during vespers, a mother arriving with pickled cabbage and strong opinions. If all went well, the two households would meet for discussions known as marriage talk, a phrase that reliably caused rashes in young men and migraines in their fathers. One mainstream historical fact emerges quietly here. The church required consent. Both parties had to agree out loud with witnesses before a marriage was valid. But that simple truth is complicated by the fact that agreement was often interpreted as did not scream loud enough to stop it. There were cases of coerced marriages later annulled, yes, but far more slipped through the system wrapped in shrugs and social pressure. No one wants to ruin a roast for the sake of legal precision. Negotiations were mercantile by nature. It was not romantic, but it was clear. One side offered a dowry, land, money, a good cloak. The other promised stability, shelter, and a man who could, if pressed, spell his own name. A quill might be produced. Someone would read a list of relatives, and then came the moment when someone inevitably asked, "And what of the sheep?" Fringe beliefs found fertile ground here. In certain alpine regions, there was a curious superstition that two people who fed the same goat would fall hopelessly in love. Local herdsmen, having observed this in action exactly never, remained skeptical. But a record from 1412 describes a woman accused of using herbal thoughts and goat magic to sway a flax merchant. The court dismissed the case, but the goat was reportedly nervous for weeks. The speed of marriage could vary drastically. There are cases where a man and woman met at sunrise and were wed before vespers, largely because someone spilled cider on the town charter, and the priest wanted to resolve the matter before the ink dried. Conversely, some courtships stretched across decades, often because of feuding families, unresolved dowries, or a mysterious curse involving spoons. In one spectacular case, a marriage arrangement fell apart over sock quality. A Flemish family presented 3 pairs, dyed indigo and lined with rabbit fur. The bride's uncle declared them inadequately stitched, citing uneven tension. Voices were raised, a chicken was thrown, the engagement ended. Months later, she married a man who spun his own wool and kept his opinions to himself. Historians still argue whether that first uncle had a point or simply resented the Flemish dye industry. Clothing, in general, was deeply entangled in the mating process. A man's belt might hint at income level. A woman's headscarf might suggest her family's political leanings. Buttons, those rare and expensive curios, were flirtatious by accident. A shirt with too many buttons implied wealth, carelessness, or a strong-wristed seamstress nearby. A man once sewed 47 buttons onto a tunic just to impress a reeve's daughter. She married a monk instead. And monks, though technically off the market, were sometimes approached anyway. In remote villages, the distinction between not available and not interested blurred slightly, especially if the monk was young, unshaven, and sang well at funerals. The church discouraged this. The women often did not. A record from 1294 recounts a nun writing to her former lover, now a friar, offering to leave her order if he would promise at last to stop quoting Jerome and start milking the cow properly. The sheep, meanwhile, continue to wander through the background, not just in narrative, but in reality. Flocks were vital, their wool-clothed nations, their bleating sometimes interrupted betrothal speeches, and in one recorded instance, a runaway sheep wandered into a chapel mid-ceremony and stood silently near the altar. No one removed it. The groom later claimed it was a sign. His wife disagreed, citing the smell. A raven perches on the stone lintel of that very chapel. No one notices. What counted as romantic was fluid, regional, and largely defined by which herbs were in season. Some favored dried lavender as a courtship gift. Others preferred onions braided artfully, which supposedly symbolized strength and fertility. One particularly fragrant bouquet survives in record, an arrangement of garlic, leeks, and wild turnips presented with a note that read simply, "For your breath and mine. If you are picturing poetry, do not." Medieval love poems tended to include references to falcons, gout, or overly symbolic doors. One ballad describes a woman as firm as barley and bright as a salted fish. It may have been complimentary, it also may have been written after an unfortunate meal. Families sometimes hired matchmakers, though the term was not official. These were often older women who had seen enough weddings to know who actually got along and who just looked good standing beside one another. They charged in cheese, soap, or silence. Their reputations were delicate. A matchmaker who arranged 3 unhappy unions in a row might find herself mysteriously uninvited to church and slightly too close to the pigsty during markets. Historians still debate how often love played a role in these marriages. Some claim passion found a way, through glances, gardens, and carefully baked breads. Others argue that affection, if it bloomed at all, came later, after the debts were counted, after the fields were divided, after the first 5 winters taught everyone just how loud the other snored. The truth likely lies somewhere between. And yet, for all the structure, chaos found a way. A man might meet a woman while fleeing debt collectors. A widow might fall for her tenant. One couple reportedly married after he caught her from a falling ladder. She said yes because she disliked heights and he had nice boots. Marriage was not inevitable. Spinsterhood and bachelorhood were socially awkward, but not illegal. Some chose it deliberately. Others arrived there by accident, distraction, or an inconvenient plague. A baker in York, known for his crusts and his deep distrust of onions, never married. When asked why, he replied, "Because no woman has yet offered me soup worth dying for." He died at 62, cause of death, soup, and the socks once again return. One court record describes a woman who sent embroidered socks to 2 brothers. The town debated whether this constituted a double engagement. The bishop ruled it unseemly but reversible. She married a sailor instead, and no one ever saw the socks again. A goose honks once, indignant, and waddles across the muddy threshold of what passes for a respectable hall. It is not invited, it is not discouraged. It simply exists, much like the man nervously holding a bunch of garlic and wondering if this, finally, will be the day someone agrees to marry him. Such were the stakes in certain corners of the medieval marriage market. A prospective groom, a goose that might or might not be an omen, and a bulb of garlic whose symbolism had gotten entirely out of hand. There is something suspiciously theatrical about the way medieval men prepared for matrimony. Their efforts, to modern eyes, seem less like gestures of love and more like oddly rural talent shows. A groom might plough a field in full view of a potential father-in-law, shirt off, muscles glistening in the way parchment never quite described. Another might recite verses in Latin, though half the town suspected he had no idea what he was saying. One groom attempted to impress by standing on one leg for an entire sermon. The priest was unimpressed. The bride was charmed. He later broke his ankle in a threshing accident, and they remained married until both forgot why. Among these peculiar tests of worth, the garlic ritual stands out. It is not mainstream, nor is it entirely fringe. It lurks in the murky space historians call village traditions no one wanted to admit to. The basic idea was this: a suitor would be given a clove of garlic to hold beneath his tongue during conversation with the bride's family. If he could maintain decorum without weeping, gagging, or declaring eternal war on root vegetables, he was deemed strong, truthful, and immune to faint-heartedness. If he failed, well, back to the goose. This may sound absurd, and that is because it is. But the logic, in its own twisted way, held up. Garlic was believed to reveal hidden weakness, much like marriage. The goose, meanwhile, was not symbolic of anything in particular, but it was often there. In many regions, it became customary to include a live animal in dowry negotiations, not as part of the deal, but as a sort of audience, a tethered witness, perhaps a reflection of nature's dispassionate gaze, perhaps just a convenient excuse for strange noises during tense talks. One chronicle even describes a goose honking at the exact moment a man promised to forsake all others. It was taken as a warning. The marriage proceeded anyway. 3 years later, she left him for a wheelwright. A more grounded and universally accepted fact: grooms were often evaluated by the state of their holdings. Land, yes, but also tools, sheds, and in one infamous case, the cleanliness of his goat's hooves. It was not enough to have possessions. They had to be presentable. There is a recorded incident from 1372 where a groom was rejected on the basis that his firewood was stacked like a fool's soup. But the phrase has lost meaning over the centuries, but one suspects it was not flattering. A single man might rise in desirability by gaining a well-roofed cottage, or, failing that, a bench with no visible mould. If he owned a cart, he was halfway to glory. If the cart had wheels that matched, he was practically nobility. It is difficult now, in an age of optimized dating algorithms and scented candles, to imagine the sheer erotic weight of symmetrical carpentry. And yet, there it was. Sometimes the courtship process was delayed by the groom's need to prove his financial solvency. This involved long hours, fewer shoes, and quietly selling extra barley behind one's uncle's back. It also involved avoiding taverns, paying the church tithe with actual coin, and surviving winter without borrowing fire. A man who succeeded in all three could proudly present himself as suitable, which was the highest compliment most suitors hoped for. Love, again, was considered optional, and yet feelings still occurred. There are letters, badly spelled, half erased, deeply damp, that betray affection. One man wrote to his intended, "When I think of thee, my cheese curdles not." It was, apparently, a compliment. Another penned a line so tortured, even the parchment seems to wince. "Thine eyes are like twin turnips, bright and firm, and I would boil for thee daily." The recipient reportedly read it aloud at her wedding, to someone else. Dry wit laced many of these relationships. A wife-to-be might tease her future husband about his poor handwriting or his habit of falling asleep during sermons. He might counter with exaggerated tales of his strength or the time he nearly outran a goose. They met in courtyards, in markets, in chapels, where the ceilings leaked when it rained and echoed when it did not. Historians still argue whether these informal bonds, those forged before formal betrothal, carried much weight. Canon law required consent, but the culture surrounding it was more ambiguous. Some scholars believe whispered promises by the riverbank constituted a moral contract. Others argue only the presence of witnesses counted. Still others point out that riverbanks were alarmingly popular for both promises and duck-related injuries, and therefore unreliable as legal venues. One particularly strange practice, documented only in the borderlands, involved the twig exchange. The groom would present a carefully carved branch, usually hawthorn or birch, to the bride. She would in turn break off a small twig and hand it back. The symbolism was unclear. Some suggest it represented fertility. Others say it indicated shared burden. A few suggest it was a subtle insult, implying his offering was too large and unnecessarily dramatic. Whatever the case, it made for a picturesque moment, especially when performed in spring beneath an inconveniently curious raven. The raven, by the way, has returned. It perches now on the rafters of the hall, unnoticed by all but the goose. In cases of urgency, when land transfers loomed or an old father grew impatient, weddings could be arranged with surprising haste. A feast was slapped together. Candles were borrowed. Bread was sliced with something approximating a ceremonial knife. A priest might be summoned, though his presence was not required for the sacrament. Only mutual consent was necessary. The rest was pageantry, and pageantry mattered. A groom could win favor by hiring musicians, dressing finely, or walking upright after a night of cider. One wedding record praises a groom's posture and mentions his successful effort to remain awake through the homily. Another notes, in clipped Latin, groom wept during exchange, possibly due to onion in cloak. A witness added a marginal note, unlikely. These moments mattered because weddings were public theatre. Even the smallest ceremony involved more observers than participants. Cousins watched, the reeve loitered. Someone's aunt knitted judgment into every glance. It was important that the groom appear strong, prepared, and minimally confused. This last point was key, as many grooms did not know the bride well. In some cases, they had not spoken beyond negotiations. One man famously forgot his bride's name during the vow and attempted to mumble. The priest, unimpressed, made him start over. The marriage lasted 43 years. Not all went smoothly. Rejected suitors occasionally interrupted ceremonies, though usually only to mutter. Violence was rare but not unknown. One infamous incident involved two men fighting over a bride mid-ceremony. She left with a third man entirely. The priest reportedly finished the blessing out of habit and blessed the nearest pot of stew. We do not have many records of the groom's feelings. Diaries were rare. Male introspection was not especially valued unless it rhymed, but through legal documents, stray letters, and the occasional tavern anecdote, a picture emerges. They were often nervous, often confused, occasionally in love, and frequently covered in something damp, feathered, or both. So yes, sometimes the deciding moment came down to a goose, a bit of garlic, or a quietly shared look across the pews. And sometimes it came down to a father saying, "He seems steady, and the goat has no blemishes." High praise indeed. A hush falls over the chapel. The wooden beams creak like old knees. The air smells faintly of tallow and damp stone, and the only light comes from a cluster of beeswax candles perched precariously near a wall tapestry that has almost caught fire twice. The bride stands very still, not entirely visible in the flickering half-light, which is perhaps the point. Her veil is thick, her expression unreadable, and her uncle is trying to remember which cousin was supposed to bring the blessed bread. He forgets. The ceremony proceeds. The ceremony. Many medieval marriages took place in chapels, but not always inside them. Doorways, porches, and thresholds were preferred, symbolic spaces that existed both inside and outside, much like the average medieval understanding of personal boundaries. Couples would stand in the church porch, announce their intentions, and depending on local tradition, either be led inside to complete the blessing or sent home with slightly fewer chickens than before. Marriages by candlelight were a special kind of theatrical. Often done at night, they avoided the expense of large feasts and nosy neighbors. Sometimes they were held in secret, either to bypass objections or to outmaneuver an inconvenient parent with a strong opinion and stronger throwing arm. One recorded union took place behind a stable by lantern light while the priest muttered the Latin rites in between sneezes. The only witnesses were 2 goats and a man who had wandered into the wrong pasture. It was considered legally binding. There were reasons to prefer low light: modesty, discretion, or a desire not to see the in-laws too clearly. But there were also practical factors. Candlelight hid many things: missing teeth, uncertain ages, debts, and sometimes it helped 2 people pretend that this was more romantic than it actually was. One bride, in a late 14th century account, insisted on 24 candles for her evening ceremony, claiming it was a divine number. Her groom later admitted it was the only way to identify her among her similarly cloaked sisters. Their marriage lasted 6 months, ending not in scandal, but in sheep mismanagement. The candles, however, were repurposed for a harvest vigil, and the town agreed they had been worth the investment. Mainstream historical record holds that the church gradually took more control over the wedding ceremony in the 12th and 13th centuries. Before that, marriage was mostly a civil affair: spoken vows, witnesses, and an exchange of goods. But with time, marriage was drawn into the sacred. The church porch vows were followed by mass, blessings, and increasingly elaborate expectations. By the late Middle Ages, weddings had become occasions of liturgical flair, with processions, organ playing, and fainting relatives who had not eaten since matins. And yet, behind all the solemn ritual, deals were still being made. The dowry discussions continued even after the bride had walked down the aisle, or porch, depending on the architectural enthusiasm of the local stone mason. Dowries could shift, increase, or mysteriously evaporate based on who coughed during the ceremony, or whether someone remembered the side of ham promised 3 summers ago. Fringe beliefs cropped up around the timing of ceremonies. Some believed marriages performed at night were stronger, bound by the mystery of darkness. Others insisted daytime was purer. A few eccentric communities favored twilight, declaring it the moment when souls were most flexible. One village insisted on weddings during a specific moon phase, leading to a local rush every 6 weeks and a notable increase in sibling marriages due to poor scheduling. Historians still argue whether nighttime weddings were more common among the lower classes or simply more frequently forgotten in written records. Some scholars point to the lack of documentation as evidence of social marginalization. Others suggest that it is hard to write when you are squinting at parchment in near total darkness and someone is trying to balance a candlestick on a goat. Candles themselves were a signal. Beeswax meant wealth. Tallow meant practicality. A mixture of both meant your uncle owed the cooper a favor. It was not uncommon for candles to be borrowed, traded, hoarded, or begged from relatives who had recently buried someone and still had some left over. One bride reportedly wept when her ceremony had only 3 candles. Her husband consoled her by carving their names into the wax afterwards, which was both romantic and completely destroyed the candles. The bride's veil played its own quiet role in these ceremonies, often thick, sometimes embroidered, occasionally made of mystery cloth found in a chest labeled wool. It concealed her face until the moment of blessing. In theory, this maintained modesty. In practice, it allowed relatives to whisper excitedly about whether she looked nervous, smug, or slightly taller than expected. In one case, the wrong sister was veiled entirely by accident. The error was corrected halfway through the vows, and no one ever spoke of it again. Standing beneath those dim candle flames, the bride was both participant and property. Her presence signaled an alliance of households. Her dowry was spoken of more than her disposition. If she smiled, it was considered hopeful. If she did not, it was chalked up to nerves, heat, or tight shoe straps. One chronicler dryly noted that brides rarely weep in joy, but often with accuracy. He was not invited to many weddings. The presence of the church did not always guarantee moral high ground. Priests sometimes officiated unions in exchange for favors, food, or, in one memorable case, a cartload of leeks. Records show that bishops occasionally annulled marriages on the flimsiest of grounds. One noblewoman was freed from her vows when her husband was revealed to be left-handed. Whether this reflected genuine theological concern or a personal vendetta involving chess is unclear. The raven shifts slightly on the chapel's exposed beam, silhouetted in amber light, as the couple stumbles through their vows. A single feather drops, no one notices. Post-ceremony, feasts varied. A grand wedding might involve roast game, music, dancing, and at least one spilled pottage. A modest one involved bread, ale, and strained smiles between newly related strangers. Gifts were exchanged, some heartfelt, others suspiciously re-gifted. One groom received a fine comb from a man who had no hair and no memory of giving it. The bride received a tunic several sizes too large, which she repurposed into curtains. In some regions, a curious tradition followed the wedding, the bedding ceremony. The couple was escorted to their chamber, tucked into bed, sometimes literally, and watched over by smiling relatives with very different definitions of privacy. This was not universal, and in some places it was performed symbolically with no actual nudity, though that rarely stopped the village baker from offering commentary. One groom is recorded as saying, "I feared the vows, but not nearly as much as your grandmother tucking in my feet." Modern ears may find this barbaric, but it served a legal function. The marriage, once witnessed and physically confirmed, however vaguely, was harder to dissolve. Without that final step, a union could be contested. Hence, the importance of witnesses, candles, and uncomfortable cheering from the hallway. When dawn broke after a wedding night, there were often expectations, a return to the bride's family for further discussion of land rights, gift inventories, and whether the cheese plate had been returned. In-laws became part of the household ecosystem. Some were helpful, some were loud, some believed themselves entitled to live in the best corner of the cottage and hum judgmentally whenever the couple argued. And there was no honeymoon, not officially. A rare few took brief journeys to shrines or relatives in other towns, but most returned quickly to chores, debt, and the immediate realization that the pig still needed salting. Romance, if it came at all, came later, after the laundry, after the leaks, after the quiet moment when two people, married by candlelight, stared at each other across a field and admitted they both disliked the goat. Some veils are decorative, others are deeply strategic. In the medieval marriage market, a veil could hide anything from a chipped tooth to a disputed lineage, to the simple fact that no one remembered what the bride actually looked like anymore without it. It was not deceit exactly, it was tradition, a tradition that conveniently allowed for minor visual misunderstandings to be sorted out only after the vows were said, the bread was blessed, and the door was very firmly locked. The veil did many things at once. It suggested modesty, it created mystery, it gave overexcited aunts something to dramatically lift at the right moment. But it also protected against what was known, delicately, as pre-nuptial reconsideration. For when expectations met candlelight, and that candlelight hit a particularly unexpected jawline, the veil gave everyone a few extra seconds to practice commitment. Behind the veil, of course, stood the bride, and with her the weight of inheritance, household alliances, and whichever relative had bet half a pig that she would marry by Whitsun. To many families, a daughter's marriage was not merely social elevation. It was financial calculation, public theatre, and a last-ditch hope that Uncle Willem's suspicious debts might finally vanish under the respectable blanket of matrimony. Mainstream records note that dowries were central to these calculations. A good dowry could include land, livestock, linens, or in certain exciting cases, actual coin. But not all dowries were material. Some were promises, future inheritance, loyalty pacts, the right to graze 3 sheep along someone else's ditch. One noblewoman's dowry was famously described as 2 fields, 1 stubborn mule, and silence from her brother regarding a certain mill fire. It was enough. The groom agreed. What the veil also hid sometimes were less agreeable secrets. Prior betrothals, previously broken engagements, entire cousins. In a time before centralized record-keeping, the margin for romantic error was wider than it probably should have been. There are cases of double marriages, unintentional bigamy, and one especially convoluted incident in which 2 sisters married the same man a year apart without realizing it. To be fair, he had grown a beard. Fringe beliefs clung to veils like lint. Some believed a veil protected the bride from envious spirits. Others swore that lifting it too early would cause barrenness. One Flemish text insists that a bride who glimpses her groom before the veil is lifted will bear children with crooked toes. No one asked how this applied to brides who already knew their husband well enough to know his elbows whistled when he sneezed. Historians still argue about the veil's deeper meanings. Some view it as religious, an echo of the sacred, a shield of virtue. Others see it as a symbol of ownership transferred from father to husband with a single theatrical reveal. Still others argue that veils were mostly practical, a way to keep dust, sun, and unsolicited compliments at bay. One 14th century poem praises a bride's veil as more merciful than spring rain and nearly as opaque. It was not only women who had things to hide. Grooms sometimes arrived with questionable backstories, forged debts, or exaggerated titles. One knight insisted he owned a castle. It turned out to be a barn with particularly aggressive chickens. His bride stayed anyway, though the chickens were reportedly unbearable. Clerical records occasionally reveal moments of stunning clarity. A wedding in 1397 was halted midway when a man stood up and declared that the bride had been promised to him first. The bride responded by lifting her veil, staring directly at him and saying, "Then why did you marry Elsa from the next village?" The wedding resumed. The man was not invited to the feast. Marriages of the time relied heavily on the appearance of respectability. The veil allowed for controlled spectacle. Guests would whisper, mothers would nod. The priest would glance upward, as if silently asking for divine confirmation that everyone was who they said they were. In one rare drawing from a parish ledger, a bride is depicted so completely enveloped by her veil that only her shoes are visible. They were excellent shoes. In some towns, it became custom for the bride to walk through the village fully veiled in the hours before the ceremony. The idea was to show humility, avoid gossip, and subtly display whatever new fabric the family had splurged on. One widow is said to have worn the same veil at 3 weddings, her own, her daughter's, and once by accident when walking home from market. No one questioned it. Fashion was confusing and veils were frequently mistaken for tablecloths. A raven watches from the church spire as yet another bride emerges in shrouded glory. The wind lifts the hem of her veil just slightly. A single feather drifts down unnoticed. There was danger too in what the veil could conceal. Cases of bait and switch brides were not unheard of, usually involving distant cousins, strategic lighting, and priests with poor eyesight. One account from the Alps describes a wedding where the bride's face was not revealed until after the ceremony, by which point it became clear she was someone else entirely. The groom reportedly sighed and said, "Well, she's taller," and the marriage was allowed to proceed. Once unveiled, the bride took her place in a new world, that of her husband's household, rules, and sleeping arrangements. The transition could be abrupt. One woman moved 30 miles on foot, spent her wedding night sharing a loft with pigs, and spent the next morning arguing about oat porridge with a mother-in-law who could neither read nor be reasoned with. Their relationship improved slowly, mostly through the strategic application of ale. But not all transitions were bumpy. Some couples found quiet rhythms in the days after the wedding. A shared dislike of the same cousin, a mutual hobby in criticizing cheese texture. One particularly stable marriage began with a mutual confession of forgetting half the vows. They rewrote their own. It rhymed. The priest was unimpressed. Even where love was absent, a kind of companionship often grew. Two people, bound together by land, law, and social expectation, would eventually find a way to endure each other's habit. The loud eating, the drawer full of mysterious buttons, the long sighs over misplaced hammers. It was not romance, but it was dependable. One lesser-known custom, mostly among merchant families, was the veil burning. After a certain number of years, often 5 or 7, the bride would ceremonially burn her wedding veil in the hearth. This marked her full transition from outsider to mistress of the house. Or, in some cases, it marked her realization that no one was coming to take her back. Either way, it involved fire and slightly smug satisfaction. Despite its power, the veil could not shield from everything. Rumors still found their way in. Disappointment still unfolded. One bride, upon arriving at her new home, discovered that her groom's promised vineyard was actually a row of ill-tempered grapes in a neighbor's field. She sighed, removed her veil, and promptly began building a fence. Through it all, the veil remained a central figure, never speaking, always fluttering, holding its secrets like old parchment holds wine stains. It knew more than it told. It softened flaws, delayed panic, and occasionally caught bits of bread during clumsy blessings. And then, at the precise moment of unveiling, sometimes at the altar, sometimes in the bridal chamber, sometimes not until morning, it let go. It gave up its secrets, dropped its mysteries, and became something else entirely. A scarf, a memory, a cloth packed away for another generation's quiet drama. What the veil hid was never just a face. It was an entire system of expectation, hope, barter, and bluff. When it fell away, marriage truly began. For better, for worse, and very often with someone asking, "Is that goat supposed to be inside?" It is difficult to pinpoint the exact moment love became inconvenient, but it was likely shortly after someone married a person they did not particularly like in order to appease a barley contract. Love in the Middle Ages was not encouraged to roam freely. It was to stay in its lane, wear proper shoes, and obtain written permission from the bishop if it intended to speak during meals. When it slipped outside of these guidelines, when it crept across hedgerows or passed between glances at candlelit vigils, it became a legal matter. Not all love was criminal, but much of it was deeply unhelpful. If a man fell in love with someone already promised to a minor noble, he could expect anything from fines to forced pilgrimage. If a woman declared herself in love with a baker's apprentice while already betrothed to a shoemaker's cousin, her family might consider relocating to another parish entirely, just to avoid ecclesiastical embarrassment and pie-related gossip. One mainstream historical reality. By the 12th century, the Church had taken full control of marriage. Consent became paramount. Both parties had to agree freely. On paper, this sounded progressive. In practice, it meant that the Church now had the right to investigate whether that yes had been uttered with proper theological posture. And so began the era of marriage courts, love trials, and very long discussions about what someone really meant when they said, "I suppose that will do." Love, if it occurred outside of a sanctioned marriage, was dangerous, not just socially, but legally. Adultery, pre-contract, secret betrothals, they all triggered ecclesiastical hearings, many of which were held in damp rooms filled with disappointed clergy. Some trials centered on vague promises. One man was brought before a bishop because he had told a woman he would rather her than the pig, which she took as an offer of marriage. He claimed it was a joke. She produced witnesses. He was fined and married. The pig remained uninvolved. Fringe beliefs circulated as always, giving some hopeful couples reasons to ignore canon law entirely. One such belief held that if two people clasped hands over a plough, their union was blessed by St. Isidore and did not require a priest. Another insisted that if a woman dreamt of a man 3 nights in a row, they were spiritually wed. In one recorded instance, a woman claimed such dreams about a man she had never met. Upon learning this, he left town immediately. Historians still debate whether courtship customs like these were genuinely widespread or exaggerated by chroniclers with an eye for scandal. Some argue that trial records overrepresent dramatic cases and that most unions formed quietly, with only minimal deception and an acceptable number of ducks. Others point out that these records reflect precisely the kind of bureaucratic energy that flourished when theology met livestock. Secret marriages were particularly problematic. Technically valid if consent was freely given and consummation followed, they were almost impossible to regulate. Families detested them, bishops denounced them, yet they persisted, often in barns, near stables, or under stars that had absolutely no idea they were complicit in such things. One such union involved a travelling mason and a farmer's daughter. They exchanged vows behind a cider barrel and exchanged bread as a token. 2 months later, her family discovered the truth. The mason fled. She sued. The bishop, weary and half-deaf, ruled in her favor, but fined both for disrupting the order of divine instruction and apple business. It is unclear what the latter part meant. Likely, someone had stolen cider. Sometimes love became a matter of forged documents. A particularly ambitious young man once produced a letter claiming he had papal permission to wed the reeve's niece. It was written in Latin on suspiciously fresh parchment and signed His Holiness Pope Gregory, or possibly Urban. The bishop squinted at it, asked the groom 3 questions in Latin, and annulled the ceremony with a sigh so loud it startled a passing mule. The silent raven watches from the wooden beam above the courthouse. Its head tilts slightly, as though it has heard this sort of case before. Not all love was unwise. In rare cases, affection emerged slowly within marriage and surprised everyone. A man might discover that his wife was clever with figures, could count better than the reeve, and had opinions about wool prices that made him question his own upbringing. One record tells of a couple who married for reasons entirely financial, and after 3 years of shared chores and mutual dislike of the parish cantor, admitted they liked each other quite a bit. Their anniversary was celebrated with pie and silence, but for those who acted on love prematurely or outside legal bounds, the consequences could be both humiliating and bizarre. Public penance was common. Offending parties might be made to stand barefoot at the church doors, holding candles and listening to sermons about proper affection. Others were required to donate to the poor, contribute to roof repairs, or in one unusual case, knit 14 pairs of gloves for the bishop's nephews. There was one loophole: betrothal. If a couple had exchanged a promise to marry, known as a pre-contract, that could sometimes shield them from punishment, but only if it was provable. Witnesses, items exchanged, or memorable phrases helped. One woman defended her betrothal by recalling that her suitor had said, "I shall love you as I love my dog, if not more." The court accepted it. The dog's reaction is not recorded. Courts also had to rule on clandestine contracts, marriages entered without public notice. These were risky but common, especially among those without property to transfer or reputations to salvage. Canon law allowed them. Social law did not. One priest refused to bless a clandestine couple's union until the groom publicly admitted that he had murmured things beneath the harvest moon not suited for the unmarried. He did so, blushing. She giggled. They married. Her uncle was furious. Love between social classes was discouraged, but not impossible. A servant marrying a merchant's daughter could trigger lawsuits, confiscations, and very pointed dinner invitations. One nobleman attempted to disown his daughter after she married a man who made ink. He later recanted when she reminded him that he could no longer write letters without her husband's help. They reconciled by mutual disdain for poetry. One strange case involved a woman who married a man believed to be dead. He returned from war unexpectedly, interrupting a dinner she was having with her second husband. A legal nightmare ensued. Ultimately, the church ruled that her second marriage was invalid, but no sin had been committed as she had acted in good faith. The first husband, somewhat dazed, agreed to return to his old job and said very little ever again. Annulments were the final frontier. If love became unbearable, or was revealed to have occurred under improper theological conditions, couples could appeal to the church. Grounds included non-consummation, coercion, consanguinity, or failure to produce male heirs, which was, unofficially, everyone's favorite reason, even if it was no one's fault. The process was long, involved many fees, and usually ended with someone moving in with their cousin. Despite all of this, love persisted. It slipped between the lines of arranged contracts, bloomed in kitchens, lingered near wells. It arrived unannounced, stayed too long, said foolish things, and survived court fines. It ducked under veils, laughed during sermons, and refused to be entirely extinguished by cold pews or colder glances. In the end, love in the medieval world was not unlike love today, unpredictable, inconvenient, and deeply suspicious to everyone except the two people experiencing it. The only difference was that back then you might be required to knit gloves about it. There is a particular sound that a mother-in-law makes when settling into a home that is no longer technically hers, but still contains all the furniture she picked. It is a sigh layered with history, implication, and just the faintest trace of triumph. In many medieval marriages, this sound was the background music of daily life, because while the bride and groom may have exchanged vows, walked solemnly through the church porch, and taken possession of a small thatched dwelling, the mother-in-law was already there, usually physically, certainly spiritually. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not just between two people, it was a household merger, a realignment of alliances, and frequently an aggressive cohabitation with someone's parent, often his, occasionally both. The husband brought not only his livestock debts and exaggerated carpentry skills, but also his mother, who had survived plague, war, and possibly 3 other daughters-in-law. She had thoughts, she had opinions, she had her own ladle. The hearth was her domain. Even if the new bride was meant to take over the running of the household, she did so under the watchful eye of a woman who remembered when butter was churned properly and cabbage was not overboiled like some sort of foreign indulgence. In one documented account, a mother-in-law quietly reboiled her daughter-in-law's stew every night for a month before the young woman finally moved it outside and let the goats finish it. The marriage survived. The stew did not. Mainstream records affirm that multi-generational households were common, particularly among peasants and small landholders. Resources were shared, land was passed down, sometimes only verbally, and privacy was a concept reserved for noble women and suspiciously silent monks. A married couple might sleep in the loft above the animals, while his parents occupied the ground floor near the hearth and the door and the pickled beets. The new wife had to find her place quickly. She brought her own linens, habits, and family stew preferences. She tried to avoid offending anyone while staking out subtle territory, a shelf here, a hook there, a gently passive-aggressive rearrangement of the salt jars. It was a slow process, occasionally violent in a culinary sense. Fringe beliefs offered small comforts. One tradition held that if a new wife successfully lit the hearth on her first try, she would rule the home in peace. If it smoked, however, she would live in her mother-in-law's shadow forever. Many women pre-lit the fire before anyone arrived. Some bribed the thatcher to adjust the chimney for better draft. One pragmatic bride simply married a man whose mother had died and was considered dangerously clever for doing so. Historians still argue about the emotional tenor of these household arrangements. Some insist that older women passed down vital skills, wisdom, and practical advice in the absence of formal schooling. Others describe a battlefield of whispering critiques, territorial spoons, and disputes over how dry barley must be before it is no longer considered edible. One account from a 14th century Yorkshire household describes a woman who moved in with her new husband only to discover his mother had already assigned her chores, seating, and bedtime. The bride responded by feigning a broken ankle for 3 weeks, during which the mother-in-law handled all the housework, and was mildly impressed by her daughter-in-law's endurance. They got along famously after that, until the spoon incident. Spoons, of course, carried weight. The family's best one, often pewter, occasionally wood, sometimes simply the big one, was a symbol of status. Who used it at supper mattered. Who cleaned it afterward mattered even more. A new wife who reached for the good spoon too early could find herself assigned to laundry duty for a fortnight. One daring woman brought her own spoon. The resulting week of silent dinners was recorded in the margins of the parish account book with the phrase, "Spoon War, ongoing." The mother-in-law's presence extended beyond the hearth. She offered commentary during marital disputes, raised her eyebrows when the couple laughed too loudly, and occasionally wandered into their sleeping quarters to ask where the dried sage had gone. One wife retaliated by labeling all the jars in Latin. It worked until the village priest got involved and a sermon on pride was delivered pointedly in her direction. And yet many of these women had survived things the young bride could hardly imagine. Famine, childbirth, winter, in-laws of their own. Their judgments were harsh, yes, but often rooted in real experience. The best relationships formed slowly through shared adversity, traded herbal knowledge, and a grudging respect earned during the 3rd week of salted fish when everyone's patience was visibly eroding. One story tells of a bride who, during her first week in the house, offered her mother-in-law a seat by the fire, then quietly handed her the kindling. It was a gesture of respect, submission, and the faintest whisper of challenge. They stared at each other for a full minute. Then the older woman said, "You will need to trim the branches more," and the two lived in wary harmony for decades. The raven watches from the rafters above the hearth, unmoving, its feathers glint in the smoke. The power structure in these homes was rarely explicit. Husbands were nominally in charge, but most knew better than to interfere in kitchen hierarchies. Some tried. One man reportedly banned his mother and wife from speaking for a week after a dispute over lentil porridge. They communicated exclusively through loud chopping and spoon placement. The husband gave up and joined a monastery. He returned 2 years later and was not allowed back in the kitchen. Domestic truce depended on many things: weather, crop yield, and how often the goat got into the pantry. But the true key to household peace often came down to space. A second room, however drafty, could prevent generational collapse. A curtained corner could serve as a sanctuary. One man built a half wall between his mother and wife's cooking areas, which worked perfectly until the mother started tossing herbs over it. He replaced the wall with a tapestry. The arguments became quieter but significantly more poetic. Mothers-in-law also carried legal influence. In disputes over inheritance or household property, their word could carry unexpected weight, especially if they were widows or had connections to the local reeve. Some actively used this influence to secure better positions for their sons. Others used it to humiliate their daughters-in-law with quiet efficiency. One notable case involved a woman who insisted that her daughter-in-law's spinning wheel was cursed. It was later revealed that the wheel had simply been missing a peg. A dramatic sermon was held anyway. Affection did exist. In quieter homes, a new bride might become genuinely close with her mother-in-law. They might swap stories, recipes, and scornful observations about people who oversalted their soup. One young wife described her mother-in-law as fierce in spirit but gentle in hand, which was either a compliment or a reference to her embroidery technique. Either way, they shared a grave plot and apparently got along. The reverse also happened. A new bride, seen as bringing honor or prosperity to the household, might be celebrated with small gifts, a ring, a scarf, a story that did not end in moral doom. The mother-in-law might even advocate for her in disputes. One woman reportedly slapped her own son with a broom for speaking rudely to his wife, then invited the bride to sit by the fire and explain exactly what he had done wrong. The lesson stuck. The broom was retired in ceremony. In the end, these triangular households endured because they had to. There was no housing market, no renter's insurance, no charming studio apartments to flee to when tensions flared. One had only the fire, the damp wall, and the company of a woman who had strong feelings about how turnips ought to be peeled. And perhaps, after enough winters, that company became not just tolerable, but essential. For in a world where marriage was a contract, love was a risk, and privacy was a suggestion, sometimes the deepest bond in the household was forged between two women who both knew exactly how stubborn the man in the middle could be and exactly which spoon he was not allowed to touch. Marriage is often described as a journey. In medieval Europe, it was more like a pilgrimage undertaken without a map, accompanied by a donkey that only sometimes obeyed, and usually interrupted by someone asking where the tax records had gone. If love happened along the way, it was treated as a pleasant accident, like finding a dry bench at the feast or remembering your spouse's middle name. The rest was endurance. 7 years was considered a milestone in many medieval unions. Not officially, not sacramentally, but practically. By that point, the dowry was long spent, the goat had probably died, and both parties had stopped pretending to like each other's barley porridge. It was not unhappiness necessarily, just a quiet, durable standoff, much like the pigpen fence that had not been repaired since the wedding, but continued to hold on out of sheer resignation. The phrase "the 7-year hitch" does not appear in medieval texts, of course, but the sentiment does. Chronicles are filled with offhand references to couples past their early quarrels or settled into shared routine, which is a romantic way of saying they had stopped talking and started communicating through the placement of chairs. One chronicler described his parents' marriage as long, quiet, and largely composed of gestures. Mainstream sources confirm that divorce, as we understand it, did not exist. Marriage was permanent unless dissolved by death, church annulment, or the occasional canonically sanctioned vanishing. Separation was possible but rare, and usually triggered by bigamy, incest, or a bishop in a very bad mood. For most, the only way forward was through, and through could be a very long road indeed. Daily life for a married couple revolved around work, weather, and not murdering each other over cheese placement. Roles were usually clear. The man oversaw the field, the barn, and the grim process of yelling at fences. The woman handled the hearth, the linen, and approximately everything else. Children were common, but not guaranteed. In their absence, couples poured their affection into animals, garden plots, or long sighs while staring at the same patch of wall. One couple, recorded in a manorial ledger, were married for 23 years and only ever addressed each other in weather terms. Storms brewing could mean she was angry. Mild this morning meant he was not going to argue. Their son wrote in the margins that they seemed happy enough, though his mother once salted a fish with a level of intensity that implied deep philosophical unrest. Fringe beliefs gave some couples a sense of purpose or at least distraction. One tradition held that if you could spend 7 full years sleeping head to toe without touching feet, your marriage would be blessed with longevity. Another insisted that if your spouse ever walked through the door backward while holding a goose, your luck would reverse, though opinions varied as to which direction it would reverse toward. These customs were rarely practiced seriously, but they were excellent conversation stoppers at feasts. Historians still argue whether long marriages were based on genuine companionship or merely the absence of other options. Some point to heartfelt letters exchanged between spouses, even years into marriage. Others highlight that most of those letters begin with "regarding the matter of the missing pig," followed by a deeply emotional account of who was definitely responsible. Truth likely sat somewhere between a quiet, enduring partnership built on repetition, routine, and mutual loathing of the neighbor's rooster. There is notably very little written about marital affection after the wedding. Chronicles focus on alliances, dowries, disputes. They rarely note whether someone laughed at their spouse's jokes or adjusted their cloak during a windy market day. But every so often there are clues. A monk's notation about a husband fetching water during a birth. A tax record in which both names appear beside the phrase "refused to pay for ditch they did not dig." Solidarity, if nothing else. The silent raven lands on the roof beam of a modest cottage, rain pattering softly on thatch. Inside, a couple argues about whether the dog is technically his or theirs. Time did strange things inside a marriage. Some grew closer, others grew parallel. One couple spent 40 years sleeping in the same bed and were buried at opposite ends of the graveyard due to an unresolved cider disagreement. Another spent 3 decades in mild silence and died within days of each other, possibly from love, possibly from the fish. By the 7-year mark, most expectations had been revised. The illusion that one spouse would learn to sing, stop chewing loudly, or remember feast days without a chart had usually evaporated. What remained was an intricate balance of habit, proximity, and the slow accumulation of minor irritations turned domestic choreography. He knows she will mutter about the hearth ashes. She knows he will misplace the bucket. They both know neither will fix the roof until it collapses. And somehow, this is a kind of peace. Conflict, when it came, was small and sharp. The wrong bread, the repeated story. The time he referred to her sister as that woman with the eyebrows a little too fondly. But in most cases the argument would ebb by morning, replaced by shared chores and the unspoken agreement that no one had time to start over. In-laws faded into the background over time, sometimes through death, sometimes through strategic relocation to cottages with weaker roofs. Neighbors, more exciting in the early years, became dull in their predictability. The world shrank to the rhythm of field, hearth, and the occasional drunken feast where someone inevitably tried to race a goose. One tale, possibly apocryphal, tells of a couple who never once spoke aloud in front of others, not out of disdain, but because they communicated entirely through looks. At their golden anniversary feast, a neighbor asked the husband how they had lasted so long. He replied, "I have never once corrected her spoon grip." She nodded once, slowly, and returned to her bread. Intimacy existed, but rarely in the poetic forms beloved by modern audiences. It was in the shared cup, the untied boot, the quiet way someone moved the stool closer to the fire when the other was not looking. One man wrote in his will that his wife should be given first choice of blankets and my knife, for she sharpens it best. It is hard to imagine a more sincere expression of trust. And yet, some marriages did dissolve in practice, if not in law. One spouse might move into the barn, the shed, or a cousin's house across the lane. Technically still married, socially estranged. One woman refused to speak to her husband for 11 years, citing an incident involving a miscounted sheep and an overly confident neighbor. They reconciled after he caught a cold and needed someone to fetch onions. As the years wore on, couples developed strange habits. One husband would whistle only on Tuesdays. His wife responded with a daily inspection of his boots, commenting on their honesty. Neither explained these behaviors. They were simply the way things were. No one else was involved, except perhaps the boots. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not an adventure. It was a field to be tilled, a room to be shared, a silence to be endured, and sometimes, if you were lucky, a place to fall asleep beside someone who knew exactly how you liked your pottage, not because you told them, but because after 7 years, it had become the only way either of you could eat it. In a world without reliable post-functioning maps or standardized surnames, one unfortunate fact of medieval marriage was that spouses occasionally disappeared. Not dramatically, not always maliciously, though sometimes quite inconveniently, but simply slipped out of town and failed to reappear. A pilgrimage gone long. A trade journey that forgot to circle back. A visit to an aunt who, in hindsight, may never have existed. And yet, under both church and common law, missing did not mean unmarried. You were still wed. You just had fewer dinner arguments and more questions from the neighbors. This was not particularly rare. Men left for crusades, campaigns, fairs, or fishing trips that spiraled into something significantly longer. Women, too, occasionally vanished, though with more suspicion and significantly more questions involving baked goods. The church took an oddly patient view. A spouse might be presumed dead only after years had passed, 7 in some cases, or even longer, depending on how many witnesses could be gathered and whether or not the local bishop was having a suspicious month. Mainstream legal tradition in England, for example, treated marriage as enduring unless formally dissolved or convincingly abandoned. If your spouse left and never returned, you had to wait. And wait. And perhaps wait some more while someone searched the next county or checked if your husband had remarried under a slightly different spelling of his name. One woman waited 15 years, then remarried. Her first husband returned 2 weeks later, sunburned and surprised. The second husband joined a monastery. The woman reportedly kept both of their shoes. Absence complicated everything. Property rights, inheritance, custody of pigs. If a spouse was presumed dead but not proven dead, their belongings technically could not be redistributed. This led to deeply awkward conversations with bishops and reeves, especially when a widow was found managing a household while still legally married to someone possibly living in Bruges under an assumed identity and an unfortunate beard. Fringe beliefs were not helpful. One claimed that if a spouse disappeared on a Thursday, they would return by candle season. Another insisted that placing their shoes under the bed upside down would summon them. Yet another said that if they did not return within 7 harvests, they had clearly been taken by forest spirits and should be left to their fate. Several peasants claimed their missing husbands had joined wandering bands of holy men. Others suspected they had joined women named Isabel with suspiciously loose understandings of monogamy. Historians still argue about how communities handled these disappearances. Some believe informal remarriages were quietly accepted after a time, provided no one made a fuss. Others argue that villagers remained stubbornly cautious, fearing ecclesiastical reprisal or social scandal. A few speculate that people simply stopped mentioning their vanished spouse altogether, especially if the new one was better at cooking or less prone to loud opinions about taxes. One telling example, a cobbler left for a fair in Lincoln and was not heard from for 7 years. His wife eventually moved into a smaller cottage, took in laundry, and quietly referred to herself as betwixt husbands. And when the cobbler returned, having been conscripted into a merchant caravan, injured in a goose-related incident, and then waylaid by marriage to a woman in Flanders, he attempted to reclaim his house. The village priest advised them both to pray about it. No one saw the cobbler again. His wife continued to refer to herself, rather reasonably, as finished. Cases like this were made worse by the lack of paperwork. No one carried identification. Few could read. A man could reappear, insist he was someone's long-lost husband, and be accepted solely based on a scar and his ability to pronounce her name correctly. One record from 1309 describes a man who returned after a decade and was only denied by his wife when he incorrectly described their goat's temperament. The bishop ruled that she had the right to remain alone, as truth was in the goat. Sometimes people vanished without intent. Floods, storms, bandits, or just getting profoundly lost on the way to the next market. Roads were dangerous and badly marked. One man attempted to visit his brother 2 villages away and somehow ended up in Wales. He returned 4 years later, married to someone else, confused but cheerful. His original wife had by then remarried and raised 3 sons. She gave him a loaf of bread and suggested he continue walking. He did. There is also the quiet case of strategic disappearance. Marriage was, after all, a contract, and contracts can be avoided by slipping out the back door and walking until the guilt wears off. One nobleman faked his death by falling into a river. Unfortunately, he was recognized 2 years later at a tavern, trying to pass himself off as Sir Greg of the Valley. His former wife sued. The tavern was fined for harboring him. The man was ordered to return home. He declined. She took his sheep. A raven watches the distant road as a figure trudges forward, cloak soaked, face uncertain. It could be anyone. In ecclesiastical courts, abandoned spouses often faced difficult questions. Was the spouse missing or simply rude? Had they sent word? Was there proof of their death, or was the applicant merely tired of cooking for one? Some cases dragged on for years. Others were settled with remarkable efficiency, especially if the bishop disliked the absent party to begin with. In some communities there were rituals for closure. A symbolic burial. A gathering of friends to drink, weep, and whisper dramatically about what probably happened. One village held a second feast 7 years after a husband vanished. His wife presided over it in her wedding dress. The message was not subtle. Practicality usually won out. Fields needed tilling, children needed raising. Even the most stubborn priest had to acknowledge that a woman left alone for 15 years might deserve some kind of resolution. Still, remarriage without formal annulment remained risky. There are records of women fined for pretending widowhood, even after decades of silence. One woman was punished not for remarrying, but for wearing black too convincingly while doing it. One widow, perhaps prematurely titled, left her village entirely. She remarried in a distant town, started a new life, and was later reunited with her original husband at a market. They reportedly nodded at each other and continued shopping. The world, it seems, moved on. In rare cases, the opposite occurred. The missing spouse was welcomed back. The family held a feast. The children asked strange questions. The current spouse moved into the barn. It was all deeply uncomfortable. One man who returned after 12 years to find his wife remarried reportedly asked, "What did you expect?" "I said I was going to the woodpile." Her reply is not recorded. the Church never fully resolved the legal paradox of missing spouses, the rules remained strict, the exceptions broad, and the enforcement inconsistent. It left people in a kind of matrimonial limbo, married, abandoned, and possibly haunted. In the end, the assumption remained, if your spouse was alive, they were still yours. Even if they were somewhere else, even if they were quite happy about it, even if you had, in fact, forgotten what they looked like. In the medieval imagination, marriage was not a feeling or even a relationship. It was a tether. The line might stretch across countries, years, and languages, but it held. And if one day someone returned from the woods with a familiar limp and an oddly specific opinion about stew, well, you made room at the fire. Or you didn't. But either way, you were still married. In a world where marriage was intended to be permanent, the process of undoing one could feel like trying to unbake a very old loaf of rye. It was possible, but only if someone had documentation, divine patience, and a firm grasp of theological gymnastics. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on the wedding, medieval Europe offered one solution for marital regret: the annulment. Unlike divorce, which was practically heretical, an annulment declared the marriage had never been valid to begin with. A sort of ecclesiastical nevermind, often delivered through pursed lips and long Latin sighs. But it could not be requested lightly. There had to be a reason, a very good reason, or failing that, a convincingly odd one. The three most reliable grounds were impotence, consanguinity, a word which here means too closely related to avoid scandal, and pre-contract, that is, one of the parties was already married or at least had promised marriage to someone else while holding hands and possibly standing near a tree. Impotence was, by far, the most whispered about reason. The Church required that a marriage be consummated to be valid. If it could not be, and never had been, then it was as though the wedding never occurred. Of course, proving this was delicate. Trials involved invasive questions, character assessments, and, in particularly unfortunate cases, physical examinations performed by clergy who almost certainly regretted their career choices. One man was asked to perform in front of a panel of nuns. He fainted. The annulment was granted. These cases were rarely publicized, but they happened often enough to form a pattern. The wife would complain of inability, the husband would counter with too much pressure, and someone would eventually suggest prayer. If the prayer did not work, surprisingly often, it was quietly determined that the couple should part ways before the neighbors got too involved. The goat, who had no opinion, remained. Mainstream ecclesiastical law allowed for such proceedings, though they were typically drawn out and expensive. Witnesses were summoned, friends were interrogated, entire villages speculated. One wife swore her husband had not touched her since Michaelmas. He claimed she had breath like cabbage and accused her of witchcraft. The bishop sighed, blessed them both, and retired early. Consanguinity was another favorite route, though whether it was invoked out of real concern or convenient panic is still debated. Technically, the Church forbade marriage between close relatives up to the 4th degree. Unfortunately, in medieval math, the 4th degree included approximately half your village. Once family trees were properly traced, which required parchments, candles, and a cousin who could count to 8, many couples discovered that they were, legally, a little too close for comfort. One such couple, married for 6 years, applied for annulment after a monk discovered that their grandmothers were sisters. They appeared relieved. Their neighbors appeared vindicated. The village matchmaker reportedly left town that same week. Fringe beliefs about consanguinity added additional color. Some believed marrying a cousin caused weak calves and cloudy butter. Others claimed children born of such unions would be left-handed and inclined to melancholy. One superstition insisted that such marriages caused an excess of mice. A particularly unfortunate couple, plagued by an actual mouse infestation, took this as divine judgment and separated accordingly. Historians still argue whether the Church applied these laws strictly or selectively. Some bishops enforced every degree of relation, issuing annulments like bad harvest warnings. Others overlooked minor entanglements, especially if one party donated a window to the cathedral or promised not to marry again too quickly. One pope famously granted a dispensation for a noble marriage between second cousins after being gifted several barrels of olives and a horse with unusually shiny hooves. Pre-contract, the concept of a prior, informal promise to marry, was an especially slippery slope. A simple hand clasp and verbal exchange in front of witnesses could constitute a binding commitment. If either party later married someone else, the new union could be invalidated. Cue the awkward trials. Did he say he loved you? Yes. And also that he would build me a bench. Did he build the bench? No, but he cut the wood. Very well, that's enough for annulment. Some people exploited this clause creatively. One woman produced an old basket handle she claimed her husband had carved for a previous fiancé. The bishop squinted at it, declared it possibly meaningful, and let the matter drop. Another case involved a man promising to marry two sisters on alternating Sundays. He later claimed poor memory. The court ruled he was indeed confused and annulled both attempts. Then there were the imaginative claims, those marriages annulled on less traditional grounds. One groom claimed his bride had bewitched him with a song. Another bride claimed her husband was, in fact, a demon in disguise. The church, cautious but intrigued, held a hearing. He failed to recite the Lord's Prayer without weeping, and was later found living in the woods with a fox. The annulment was granted. The fox was not charged. A raven perches on the windowsill of the courthouse, head tilted, silent and deeply unimpressed. Annulments were rare, but not impossible. They were most accessible to the wealthy, who could afford petition fees, parchment, and papal messengers with strong calves. Peasants occasionally found success through persistence, loud relatives, or sympathetic clergy. But for the majority, unhappy marriages remained so, documented only in scowls, missing spoons, and the quiet decision to sleep on opposite sides of the hay pile. The process itself was slow and bureaucratic. An annulment case might involve 3 separate clerics, 5 witnesses, 2 unreliable cousins, and 1 goat that wandered in and had to be removed twice. Testimonies were copied by hand. Proceedings were interrupted by feast days, fast days, plagues, and that one time someone brought cider into the chancery and forgot why they were there. Outcomes were unpredictable. Some cases ended in annulment, others ended in temporary separation, followed by mandatory reconciliation and a brief homily about patience. One couple was ordered to take a 3-week pilgrimage together before a final decision. They returned separately, each with new cloaks and distinctly improved moods. The bishop declared it a success. Annulments carried social weight. A woman who had one was often seen as suspect, but also free. A man might remarry if he could convince a second family that the problem had been circumstantial and not personal. In one particularly tragicomic case, a man obtained an annulment on the grounds that his wife had refused to speak. He then married a woman who spoke so frequently he later claimed divine punishment. No one was sympathetic. Of course, there were false annulments, cases where the grounds were invented, exaggerated, or conveniently rediscovered. One noble claimed his wife was his cousin only after she began publicly discussing his debt. Another claimed impotence until he met someone with larger dowry prospects. These cases were hard to prove but harder to stop. The church, ever pragmatic, investigated with all the speed of a damp parchment. Some couples separated quietly without legal sanction, simply living apart and telling neighbors that God had other plans. Others stayed together, not out of affection, but because the legal path to undoing it all involved 3 bishops, 4 goats, and someone willing to swear in Latin that the marriage had never felt real. And perhaps that was the heart of it. In a time when marriages were arranged, contracted, expected, and rarely questioned, the annulment offered one small escape hatch for those clever or desperate enough to squeeze through. It was a loophole wrapped in ceremony, guarded by candlelight, and occasionally blessed by bishops who just wanted everyone to stop yelling. Still, for most people, marriage, valid or not, endured. Through disappointment, through silence, through veiled threats about stew quality and who really forgot to fix the fence. The idea of undoing it was tempting, the act of doing so was monumental. So they stayed, sometimes happily, sometimes miserably, occasionally with a goat in the next room, and a lingering hope that perhaps this, all of it, had been a very long misunderstanding, and that someone, somewhere, had the paperwork to prove it. When someone in a medieval village announced they were going on pilgrimage, the correct response was to nod solemnly, wish them blessings, and absolutely not ask whether they were bringing the good shoes or just fleeing a marriage. Because while many pilgrimages were sincere efforts to seek forgiveness, divine favor, or a small wooden badge shaped like a saint's foot, some bore an unmistakable whiff of strategic absence. In the marriage market, pilgrimage could be both devotion and a delightful way to vanish for a while. The trick was in the plausibility. Everyone understood that religious journeys were unpredictable, roads were dangerous, inns were few. One might stop in Canterbury and somehow end up in Calais. A devout husband could depart to venerate the bones of St. Edmund and return 2 years later with a sunburn, a limp, and a story involving Hungarian goats. Or he might not return at all. And if he did not, well, he had died in pursuit of holiness. No one questioned the decision, especially if he had left behind a few debts and a deeply confused spouse. Mainstream practice supported pilgrimage as a pious endeavor. The church granted indulgences, towns hosted send-off feasts. Some families even pooled resources to sponsor a pilgrim, hoping their prayers would buy collective grace. But beneath the lace of piety one could find the faint outline of marital fatigue, debt evasion, or a need to leave before anyone noticed the cooper's daughter was suddenly glowing with prenuptial fondness. Records mention husbands vanishing toward Compostela or Rome shortly after the third serious argument about leak storage. Some never reached their destination. Others did, and stayed. One man walked to Santiago de Compostela, found the weather agreeable, and sent word that he had become a cook for the shrine. His wife remarried after 8 years. When he finally returned, she greeted him with polite surprise and asked whether he remembered how to milk a cow. He did not. He was sent away. Fringe beliefs clung to pilgrimages like burrs on a woolen sock. Some claimed the journey would cleanse a person not only of sin but of bad marriages. Others insisted that touching the tomb of a saint could nullify certain vows if performed at midnight while reciting specific psalms backward. There is no evidence that this worked, but one man is recorded as having tried it 3 times before being gently told to leave the monastery and stop upsetting the goats. Historians still argue whether pilgrimage served as a genuine alternative to legal annulment or simply a tolerated excuse for strategic abandonment. Some point to the number of pilgrimage badges found far from known shrines as evidence that people wandered aimlessly. Others suggest that the badges were traded, pawned, or worn like fashionable gilt. One particularly sarcastic monk wrote that pilgrimage is often a penance for sins yet to be committed. Pilgrimage as marital escape was not limited to men. Wives, too, occasionally took the road, though they required more careful planning. A woman could not travel alone without attracting suspicion, so she might claim to be visiting a holy well, joining a group of religious women, or accompanying a cousin who was suddenly very interested in relics. One documented case describes a woman who left for the shrine of St. Winifred and resurfaced 6 years later in a coastal town, married to a shipwright. When questioned, she claimed the saint had guided her toward better timber. The court, perhaps wisely, declined to intervene. Pilgrimage routes were dotted with places where a determined person could vanish. Hostels, shrines, market towns. Names could be altered, backstories tweaked. One couple eloped during a pilgrimage and pretended to be siblings until they reached the coast. They were later caught by a suspicious innkeeper who noticed they did not argue like family. But most pilgrimage-fueled escapes were quieter. A husband gone too long, a wife who did not return, a silence filled by speculation and increasingly dramatic explanations. Neighbors would murmur, clergy would shrug, life, as always, would continue. The raven waits atop a waymarker stone along a damp road. Its feathers twitch in the breeze. Pilgrims pass without seeing it. There was also the question of intentions. Not every wandering spouse meant to flee. Some left genuinely seeking spiritual clarity, only to be sidetracked by plague, injury, or a particularly persuasive cheese merchant. One woman walked from Norwich to Canterbury, caught a fever, and awoke married to the innkeeper who nursed her. She wrote home, apologizing profusely and promising to name her first child after her previous husband. He, reportedly, did not respond. Legal structures did little to clarify matters. Canon law recognized prolonged absence as problematic, but did not automatically dissolve a marriage. A spouse could apply for separation after many years, but only with sufficient evidence, testimony, letters, relics, or at least a witness who saw the missing party vanish into the fog. In one case, a woman successfully obtained separation after producing a crust of bread, allegedly baked by her long-lost husband, now a hermit. The bishop was skeptical, but hungry. He approved the petition. Pilgrimage had symbolic power. It signified moral renewal, distance from temptation. But it also provided narrative cover for social maneuvers. He's on pilgrimage could mean anything from he's in Jerusalem to he's hiding in the shed behind his brother's house, pretending to be called John. Some married couples even took pilgrimages together, usually as a way to patch up a strained union. These were risky ventures. One couple walked to Walsingham arguing the entire way. By the time they reached the shrine, their priestly escort had developed a mysterious ear infection. They returned home with a deeper respect for silence and separate blankets. Others found renewal on the road. Travel stripped away the familiar. One woman reportedly fell in love with her husband during their joint pilgrimage after discovering he could recite psalms in 3 tones and cook passable onions. She later credited the shrine of St. Thomas for the miracle. Her husband credited the absence of her sister. And there were cases, rare but real, where a spouse returned from pilgrimage profoundly changed, humbled, repentant, even grateful. One man came back from Rome and kissed his wife's feet. She asked if he had fallen on hard times. He said no, he had merely realized she was right about everything. She immediately suspected a head injury but allowed the sentiment to stand. Still, for every pious return, there were 10 quiet absences. A cloak left hanging. A pair of boots too clean. A bed that remained half made for a year, then 2. Eventually, the village stopped asking. The spouse stopped hoping. The marriage, though not legally ended, faded into the comfortable category of formerly unfortunate. Some shrines kept records of pilgrims, but names were inconsistent, spellings inventive, and the ink often smudged by weather or regret. A man might appear as William of Dunwich in one town and Wilhelm the East Walker in another. One woman appears under 3 names across 2 shrines and a ship manifest. Whether she was fleeing, exploring, or simply indecisive is anyone's guess. And so, the road remained open, for penance, for longing, for escape, for husbands who could not explain their dreams, for wives who needed silence, for couples who feared the shriveling look of neighbors and the creeping rot of unspoken things. In the end, the line between devotion and departure was often blurred. The scallop shell worn on a pilgrim's cloak might signal spiritual rebirth, or a particularly elegant way to avoid doing the dishes forever. It is a strange and wonderful truth that in a world where women could not vote, inherit land freely, or wear trousers without alarming the neighbors, they could, on occasion, sue their husbands. Not just for neglect, not just for cruelty, but for things as varied as unpaid debts, broken marriage promises, and, in one memorable case, chronic potato fraud. The courts were not always sympathetic. The husbands were rarely pleased, but the wives, they sometimes walked away with more than satisfaction. Occasionally, they even kept the mule. The medieval marriage contract, while spiritual in theory, was deeply legal in practice, and legal things could be challenged. If a woman believed her husband had failed to uphold his end of the bargain, say, to support her, to treat her fairly, or to stop selling her combs for beer money, she could, with sufficient patience and the right witnesses, take him to court. This did not mean she would win, but it did mean someone had to listen. Eventually, mainstream records from manorial, ecclesiastical, and borough courts show that women did sue, not often, not easily, but they did. One woman in 1323 brought her husband to court for breaking the peace of the home with excessive cursing and ale spillage. The judge fined him a hen and warned him not to make the stew nervous again. Another woman sued over a ruined dowry, claiming her husband had traded her linens for a half-finished barrel. He claimed it was a good barrel. The court disagreed. These cases were possible because, oddly enough, medieval law sometimes recognized married women as legal agents, especially if their husbands were absent, dead, or catastrophically foolish. A wife running a household could bring claims, defend property, and even represent herself in local disputes. This autonomy was practical, not ideological. Someone had to keep the sheep out of the barley. Someone had to explain to the reeve why the fence was still shaped like a question mark. Fringe beliefs did not stop women from suing. If anything, they encouraged them. In parts of Wales, it was said that a woman who shouted the right words at her husband during an eclipse could curse his future lawsuits. In some English towns, women recited verses while filing complaints to ensure the judge would hear the truth, even if he'd rather not. No one believed these worked, of course. Except the husbands, who occasionally took to court wearing extra layers of garlic. Historians still argue whether these court cases reflected genuine female agency or were anomalies allowed for spectacle. Some point to repeated names in court roles. Women who appeared again and again with new grievances, sharp arguments, and increasingly nervous husbands. Others argue that these cases were tolerated but not celebrated, often resolved with fines or stern reminders that marriage was not supposed to involve so much parchment. And yet, the records remain. Like the 14th century woman who sued her husband for hiding the household salt and refusing to share the bench near the hearth, the court declared the salt a shared good and awarded her partial custody of the bench during mornings and all feast days. Or the Norfolk wife who brought her husband to trial for declaring her less clever than the goat in public. She did not win, but the goat was thereafter required to sleep outside. In some cases, women sued before marriage, claiming breach of promise. A man who courted, wooed, and whispered, but failed to follow through, could be held accountable. One woman presented a ribbon and a poem as evidence. The court found in her favor. The man was fined 3 silver coins and a morning of standing barefoot on the church steps, holding a sign that read, I am a promise breaker and also very bad at rhymes. Of course, not every case ended well. One wife attempted to sue her husband for spending all their money on pie. The judge ruled that pie was a form of nourishment, and the matter was dismissed. Another woman, accused of striking her husband with a broom, countered that he had first insulted her weaving. The court ruled that both had sinned and instructed them to fast together for 3 days. A raven reportedly watched from the roof of the courthouse, completely unfazed. Legal separation was possible in rare cases. A wife could petition for it on the grounds of cruelty, desertion, or spiritual incompatibility, though the last one usually required the kind of theological vocabulary that involved sweating priests and long pauses. One woman successfully obtained separation after demonstrating that her husband refused to attend Mass and muttered curses at candles. The court agreed. She was granted her dowry back and a small corner of the garden where he had once claimed to see demons. He was not allowed to enter the garden again. Then there was the matter of shared business. In towns, many wives worked alongside their husbands, in taverns, bakeries, shops. When disputes arose, they could sue not as wives, but as business partners. One alewife in York sued her husband for drinking the inventory. She won partial ownership of the barrels and installed her cousin as the new taproom's supervisor. Her husband, demoted to barley hauler, later attempted to appeal. He lost. The alewife was celebrated quietly, mostly with free pints. Women also sued other women, occasionally in connection to marriage. One famous case involved a wife accusing her husband's former betrothed of lingering glances and suspicious gift baking. The case was dismissed when it was revealed the cakes were for a sick uncle. The sick uncle, incidentally, testified that the cakes were slightly dry, but the boldest suits were always the ones against husbands, because to stand in court, accuse the man legally tethered to you and demand justice, that required nerve. It also required evidence, witnesses, and the kind of composure usually seen only in abbesses and mule handlers. One woman famously said nothing during her trial. She simply pointed at her husband, unwrapped a woolen bundle, and revealed 3 broken pots and a burned shoe. The judge awarded her a new shoe, 3 pots, and control of the household flour. The church watched these proceedings with cautious interest. Officially, marriage was sacred and unbreakable, but even bishops knew that sanctity did not always include fairness, and that a woman with burned stew and a bruised elbow might deserve better than a sermon. Some clerics offered mediation, others advised silence, a few, radical and likely tired, advised better husbands. One particularly poetic ruling concluded with, "A wife is not a footstool, nor a pot, nor a creature made to carry blame like firewood. Let the husband remember that silence is not always obedience, and obedience is not always righteousness." The husband understandably never returned to that court. Some women won, some did not. Some changed nothing but the tone of the household from that day forward. But each suit, each parchment, each whispered testimony changed the understanding of marriage just a little. It proved that women could be heard, even in a world designed to overlook them. And in a world where so much of marriage was about silence, shared, forced, or resigned, a single voice raised in court could echo for generations. Even if, at the end of the day, someone still had to clean the spoon. Marriage, we are told, was sacred, a holy sacrament, a union of souls under the gaze of heaven, reinforced by candlelight, confirmed by a man in robes who said Latin very quickly and often smelled faintly of damp stone and ecclesiastical authority. But between the rules and the reality stretched a yawning gap, a creaky drawbridge of loopholes, because while the church may have declared marriage indissoluble, unbreakable, and thoroughly sacred, it was also a human institution, And humans, as it turns out, are highly skilled at ignoring things when it is convenient, especially on Tuesdays. Clergy were supposed to enforce marital law with the vigilance of saints. No marriage without consent, no unions between cousins, no weddings without banns, no bedding until the priest had blessed the fish. But in practice, enforcement varied wildly. Some parishes followed every rule to the letter, others followed the letter until it got wet, crumpled, and conveniently blue behind the altar. Mainstream evidence confirms that the Church made a valiant effort to regulate marriage. They required banns to be read publicly 3 times, just in case someone had a secret spouse or a dramatic objection. They established courts to review marriages, resolve disputes, and deliver lengthy opinions about who should and should not be touching whom. And yet, in the records, gaps appear. Marriages that happened without bans, cousins quietly wed with no questions asked, priests who suddenly forgot how to read family trees. Money, of course, helped. A generous donation could smooth over many irregularities. A new roof for the vestry, and suddenly the bishop might discover that those 2 suspiciously similar families were only distantly related after all. One nobleman, having married his first cousin once removed, reportedly sponsored a new choir stall and received a formal blessing, a modest wink, and a loaf of celebratory bread. Then there were cases where the Church chose not to look too closely. A marriage between a merchant and a woman of dubious reputation. If the merchant promised to fund the next festival, the priest might decide that redemption was best served with vows. A wedding held secretly after sunset. If no one complained and the stew was shared, perhaps it had been holy all along. Fringe beliefs filled the gaps where doctrine faltered. Some villages believed that any marriage performed on the feast of St. Elmo would be automatically blessed, regardless of legality. Others claimed that if a priest looked you in the eye during confession and did not immediately faint, your marriage was valid, even if it had happened in a barn with no witnesses during a thunderstorm. One particularly generous interpretation held that if the local cleric fell asleep during your wedding, the resulting silence meant divine approval. Historians still argue whether this selective enforcement was the result of moral leniency, practical exhaustion, or a deeply medieval sense of good enough. Some posit that priests, often overworked and underpaid, preferred not to alienate parishioners by cancelling their carefully arranged alliances. Others argue that the Church quietly prioritized stability. Better a slightly irregular marriage than a public scandal involving property, goats, and someone's half-brother with a grudge. There were entire dioceses known for their flexibility. Clergy who specialized in quiet ceremonies or technical solutions. One bishop issued retroactive dispensations like bread rolls. Another created a form letter for post-wedding absolution. "Forgive us," it read, "for we were hasty, the couple was persuasive, and the dowry included excellent cheese." In some regions, couples married first and confessed later. This was known, politely, as marriage by fait accompli. The ceremony would be held without banns or blessing, followed by a humble appearance before the priest, and a generous confession involving the phrases deep love, urgent circumstances, and we had already rented the chairs. Most priests forgave quickly. A few offered pointed sermons about patience. One simply asked for a leg of lamb. A raven perched on the belfry observes a secret ceremony below, conducted in whispered Latin and illuminated by a single guttering candle. No one glances up. Sometimes the clergy themselves were the problem. Despite vows of celibacy, many priests had relationships, some public, some whispered, some accompanied by a mysterious woman referred to only as the cousin. In such cases, it became difficult for said clergy to enforce marital discipline with much credibility. One parishioner, when chided for marrying his niece's niece, reportedly replied, "And what of your housekeeper's son?" The priest changed the subject to tithes. There were entire families built on technically forbidden marriages that were quietly tolerated for generations. The church knew, the village knew, the rooster probably knew, but no one wished to disturb the delicate balance of lineage, inheritance, and not having to reassign land because someone's grandmother was also someone's cousin's wife. Annulments were officially discouraged but quietly permitted, especially for those with influence. A failed union between minor nobility could be dissolved with paperwork, prayer, and a slightly redacted account of who had been promised to whom. Sometimes two annulled parties later married each other again, presumably out of boredom or the realization that all other options were worse. The church, ever diplomatic, simply blessed the second attempt and issued a new ledger. One documented case involves a woman whose marriage was annulled due to consanguinity, then reinstated once the genealogical chart was revised by a man who may have had cataracts. The priest who re-blessed the marriage wore the same stole as the original ceremony and reportedly said, "Let us pretend this is the first time." There was also the problem of mobility. In an era when few people traveled far, even modest movement could erase history. A man with a questionable marital past might simply move 2 villages over, adopt a new surname, perhaps one involving herbs or a patron saint, and remarry without raising suspicion. Priests rarely coordinated records. Bishops did not maintain centralized databases. The system relied heavily on memory, gossip, and vague facial recognition, and so people slipped through. One man is listed in 3 parishes with 3 wives, none of whom seem to know about each other. Whether this was ignorance or tolerance is unclear. One woman, listed as possibly his third, continued to tithe faithfully for years. The church has always accepted the coins. It would be wrong to say the church approved of these things. Officially, they did not. But in practice, they turned away, or turned slightly sideways, or developed sudden interest in unrelated doctrine, because marriage, for all its holiness, was also a tangle of politics, property, and the kind of cousin math that makes everyone wish for silence. Some priests tried to crack down. They issued stern homilies. They refused to bless irregular unions. They declared bans with theatrical enunciation and excessive eye contact. And yet, those same priests sometimes found themselves officiating emergency weddings, blessing couplings that would make their bishop wince, and quietly updating the parish book with a note that read, "Ceremony completed, further discussion unhelpful." In rare moments, the church even reversed course entirely. One marriage was deemed invalid, then invalid again, all within the span of a month. The couple reportedly ignored all 3 rulings and continued to share a cottage, a pig, and a mild distrust of each other's pronunciation. The true miracle of medieval marriage may not have been love or faith or even survival. It was persistence. People married under absurd conditions, with uneven bands, reluctant witnesses, and veils made from questionable linen. The church grumbled, blessed, annulled, or ignored them, depending on the mood, the money, and the availability of fish. In the end, the rules remained, but so did the loopholes, carefully walked, softly spoken, lit by candlelight and the occasional bribe. And the church, for all its power, understood something deeply human. Sometimes it was better to look away, say nothing, and quietly hope the goat did not start talking. The first marriage was solemn, perhaps even hopeful. Vows were exchanged under the quiet gaze of the church porch. A stew was slightly oversalted. Someone gave a speech about prosperity and pigs. Then the years passed, the linen wore thin, and one spouse, eventually, died. Or so it was believed, in some cases confirmed, in others simply assumed with enthusiasm. Enter the second marriage, a legal, logistical, and occasionally spectral conundrum. Widowhood was a recognized social category in medieval Europe. Widows wore dark clothing, enjoyed newfound fiscal caution, and were expected to look both tragic and slightly more available. The church provided clear guidelines. A widow could remarry, but not too quickly. 40 days was the minimal mourning period, enough time, one supposes, for grief, paperwork, and the quiet reassignment of spoons. Men, predictably, often remarried faster. A widower might find himself betrothed again before the ink on his wife's will had dried, assuming there had even been a will and anyone present could read. One man reportedly remarried on the feast day following his wife's burial. The priest hesitated, the choir coughed, and the stew was reused. Mainstream custom dictated that widows wait longer. Not from law, but from social expectation. A woman who married too soon risked being labelled hasty, calculating, or insufficiently tearful. Yet many did remarry, and often well. And a widow with land, livestock, or experience was a valuable asset. One chronicler described a well-connected widow as more desirable than spring barley and only slightly harder to harvest. But second marriages carried complications. There were property rights to renegotiate, dowries to reevaluate, siblings to reassure, and ghosts. Fringe beliefs about the dead loomed large in these unions. Some swore that if a second spouse wore the clothing of the first, the spirit would appear and scowl. Others claimed that ghosts of the deceased watched over second marriages with judgmental silence, particularly if their old spoon had not been returned to its proper place. One widow reportedly refused to remarry until her late husband's boots had been buried in consecrated ground. The boots were buried. The marriage proceeded. The boots were later found inexplicably in the rafters. Historians still argue how seriously people took these spectral concerns. Some see them as metaphor, emotional guilt rendered into folklore. Others argue the fear was genuine. Parish records include whispered notes about unsettled houses, mirrors turned toward the wall, and one particularly alarming entry: bride reports dream of former husband asking for more salt. No action was taken. Ghosts or no, the practicalities of second marriages were thorny. A woman bringing land from a previous union had to ensure her new husband did not absorb it entirely. In theory, ecclesiastical law protected her holdings. In practice, much depended on who held the keys, the cellar, and the attention of the local reeve. One widow cleverly arranged her second marriage contract to include a clause: husband to refrain from touching pickled goods without express permission. Her first marriage had been marked by mysterious vinegar shortages. The new husband signed the clause and reportedly respected it. Another woman, marrying a man 20 years her junior, insisted on retaining control of the family ox. Her reasoning: he may plough, but I shall direct. It was an unusual arrangement. The ox was untroubled. For men, second marriages offered similar complications, though less frequently challenged. A widower might seek a younger wife to manage the household, produce heirs, or simply explain why his socks kept vanishing. But if he remarried too well, questions arose. Had he loved the first wife? Had she truly died? Had anyone checked? In one town, a man was publicly questioned after remarrying a woman who looked suspiciously similar to the first, but with better posture. The matter was dropped. A raven perches quietly on the lintel of the cottage. It watches as the newlyweds sweep the floor and silently move the last of the first wife's candlesticks to the cupboard. Second marriages also required delicate negotiations with stepchildren, in-laws, and, most perilous of all, local memory. Villages remembered everything. They remembered how the first wife wore her hair, how she salted the fish, and how she once shouted at a neighbor for stepping on her bean patch. The second wife, entering this ecosystem of half-remembered affections, had to navigate a social web full of ghosts, both literal and metaphorical. Some managed. One woman reportedly won over her new husband's household by baking a pie so transcendent it silenced all talk of the former spouse. Another cleverly redirected attention by organizing a Saints' Day pageant complete with costumes, moral ambiguity, and a very confused donkey. And some didn't manage. One second wife was accused of witchcraft after moving the family stool from its traditional place. She insisted it was for better firelight. Her stepchildren insisted it was a sign of upheaval. The priest resolved the matter by declaring the stool neutral and moving it himself. Second marriages also introduced logistical puzzles. Could the dowry from the first be reused? Did it count as property or sentiment? One man reused his late wife's wedding veil, adding new embroidery. His second wife found it touching. His neighbors found it unsettling. A third wife was not consulted. In rare but fascinating cases, the second marriage overlapped suspiciously with the first. A man might claim his wife had died, remarry, and then find himself face to face with a very alive and extremely annoyed first wife. Courts were not always prepared for this. In one recorded case, the priest simply blessed everyone present, made the sign of the cross 3 times, and excused himself from further comment. Spouses presumed dead could return unexpectedly. A woman once remarried after her husband was thought drowned. He reappeared 7 years later, dripping and holding a crab. She welcomed him in, made him tea, and sent a message to her second husband requesting a conversation. The records do not reveal the outcome, but the crab was reportedly delicious. And then there were the ghosts that never left. Not the supernatural kind, but the ordinary hauntings, memories, routines, the absence of a particular cough. One man refused to remarry because his first wife's voice still echoed in the rafters. Another could not bring himself to sell her boots. A woman kept setting 2 places at supper, just in case. It was not eerie, it was simply what remained. For all the practical chaos, second marriages often worked. They brought stability, shared labor, occasionally even affection. One couple, both widowed, were known for bickering loudly while feeding chickens. They remained together for 2 decades. When she died, he built her a bench beneath the elm tree and reportedly told the tree she was sharp but fair. The church, ever adaptable, generally blessed second marriages provided the first had ended with sufficient formality. Some clerics preached caution, others encouraged it. One bishop reportedly declared, "Better a second union than a third sin." This was considered progressive, if slightly vague, and in some cases second marriages offered the kind of quiet, durable happiness that had evaded the first. Fewer illusions, fewer expectations. A shared understanding that love might be nice, but shared chores and compatible pottage preferences were far more reliable. By then, ghosts tended to settle. Whether real or imagined, they found their place in the cupboard, the story, the second-hand veil. They were acknowledged, then gently ignored. In the end, a second marriage in the medieval world was less about rebirth than about continuity. The stew still simmered, the fire still needed tending. Someone still had to mind the goat, and perhaps that was enough. Some marriages ended with a whisper, some with a plague, a few with the sudden realization that the other person had absolutely no idea how to salt cabbage properly. But for many couples, the final and fiercest battle came not over property, reputation, or dowry, but over something far more intimate: the spoon. Not just any spoon, the spoon. The one that had always lived on the second shelf, carved from boxwood or horn, perhaps tipped with pewter if one were especially lucky or extravagant. The spoon used for stews, for porridge, for feeding the ill, and occasionally for scolding the less ill. The spoon whose shape fit just so in the hand, whose bowl had been licked thoughtfully through winters and fasts, whose handle carried a chip that looked suspiciously like a cousin's tooth. In a medieval household, objects mattered. Utensils were not mass-produced, they were personal, sometimes inherited, and often shared between generations with all the sentimental weight of a family crest, only with more soup stains. And when a marriage soured, it was not uncommon for the spoon to become the silent focus of everything that had gone unsaid for years. Mainstream property law offered little help. Technically, most household goods were shared, but in practice, division after separation or widowhood or sudden departure involving suspicious bread was deeply negotiable. One spouse might claim the spoon as part of their dowry, the other might declare it a gift from their long-dead grandmother. The priest might advise them to give it to the church and hope no one remembered who licked it first. One case recorded in a Yorkshire church roll describes a widow who refused to remarry unless she retained sole rights to the household spoon and the basin with 3 cracks. Her suitor agreed, possibly because he had lost an eye in a cider incident and had no sense of symmetry. Their union was reportedly calm and deeply hygienic. Fringe beliefs did not help. In parts of the Low Countries, it was said that if a couple shared a spoon during courtship, but later married someone else, the original spoon would weep. Another tradition held that spoons used in marriage should be buried with the first spouse. This became awkward when a second spouse inherited the house and discovered a collection of deeply sentimental cutlery beneath the hearth. Historians still argue whether the spoon disputes were symbolic or just practical. Some insist that spoons represented household authority, who served whom, who stirred, who tasted. Others believe it was simply about ownership in a world where almost nothing belonged to you outright. When one's land was leased, clothing inherited, and goat technically shared with the Reeves' cousin, a spoon might be the only true possession left. And so, when tensions rose, the spoon became an artifact of power. Arguments flared, accusations flew. One woman struck her husband with the very spoon in question, claiming he had been about to give it to his brother. He countered that it was a wedding spoon and therefore communal. The village priest declared it tainted by intent and ordered it burned. The couple divorced in spirit, though not in law. She kept the ashes. It was not only spoons, other items could trigger disputes: pots, knives, stools, even blankets. But spoons carried an intimacy that was difficult to ignore. They were used daily, touched constantly, cleaned carefully. A shared spoon was a shared life. To claim it after separation was to declare that your version of the marriage had mattered more. Some disputes were resolved creatively. One couple agreed to split the spoon, literally. The resulting halves were mounted on separate plaques, hung over different hearths, and referred to with quiet triumph. Another couple rotated custody of the spoon based on the liturgical calendar. One received it during Lent, the other during feasts. A scribe noted, "No love lost, but meals remain blessed." The raven watches from the chimney flue as a spoon is carefully set on the table between 2 glowering spouses. It says nothing, but if it could, one suspects it would request a transfer. There were rare but memorable spoon trials, public proceedings in which each party presented arguments, witnesses, and, on one occasion, a poetic lament in rhyming couplets. The judges, often minor clergy with mild headaches, ruled based on perceived sincerity, known reputation, and who brought bread. One man lost his spoon rights because he referred to it as just a piece of wood. His wife smiled, collected it, and left with a nod. Sometimes the fight was delayed. A widow might retain possession of her spoon until remarriage, at which point her late husband's relatives appeared with quiet insistence and a vague letter about inheritance. One woman sewed her spoon into a pillow and dared them to find it. They did not. The pillow was later buried with her, the spoon still inside. The inscription on her grave reads, she stirred, and she endured. In taverns and workshops, the phrase "the spoon fight" became shorthand for bitter domestic disagreement. It was said that when a couple quarreled too loudly, the spoon would leap from the shelf. A superstition, yes, but one that led to an unusual number of broken utensils and sheepish apologies involving mashed beans and awkward toasts. In some towns, spoons were gifted at weddings. These were carved with initials, blessings, and, if the carver was particularly bored, puns. They were meant to symbolize unity, shared sustenance, mutual taste. But over time, they became contested trophies. One bride reportedly burned hers in the hearth when her husband complimented another woman's broth. The broth was later deemed fine, but not worth it. The church occasionally stepped in. Some bishops encouraged couples to gift their spoon to the parish, transforming personal tension into public piety. A few altars collected dozens of spoons, some engraved with tearful messages. One simply read, "She salted twice." Children, when they existed, were occasionally caught in the middle. Inheritance disputes included spoons. One daughter claimed her mother's spoon as part of her trousseau. Her brother objected, stating it was his by soup seniority. The reeve intervened. The spoon was placed in the town chest and never spoken of again. But most disputes were quiet, simmering. Two people living in the same house, eating separately, each with a new spoon that somehow did not feel right. The original remained on a high shelf, untouched, dusty, not forgotten. And still the symbolism lingered. A man might give a spoon as a token of affection. A woman might return it as a farewell. Some carried old spoons as reminders of soup shared, of vows whispered, of fights about herbs that no one quite won. In one particularly poetic case, a couple known for their silence reportedly buried their spoon beneath a tree on their 20th anniversary. No explanation was given. When asked, the husband shrugged. The wife simply said, "It has served." The tree, incidentally, still stands. There are records of spoons passed between generations, some inscribed with initials, others notched with quiet marks. One such spoon, now in a museum, carries 27 small cuts along its handle. The curator theorizes they represent winters, or reconciliations, or possibly the number of times the stew was too thin. And so, in a world where love was fragile, permanence rare, and goats unnervingly familiar, the spoon endured. Fought over, cherished, mourned. A utensil, yes, but also a history, a domestic relic. The last thing packed when leaving, the first thing reached for in comfort. When all else failed, when the words dried up, when the hearth grew cold and the barley spoiled, there remained the final question. The one no priest could answer, no bishop could resolve, no chronicler could quite write down. Who gets the spoon? Somewhere a candle flickers. The last stew of the evening has been stirred, and the ladle left to lean lazily in the bowl. The hearth creaks as the stones breathe out the day's warmth, and outside the sheep are silent, if they are even still awake. And in the modest dark of a thatched house, a couple, two people stitched together by vows, persistence, or the sheer endurance of habit, settle into the deep quiet that marriage eventually becomes. Not the dramatic kind, not the tales that get sung at markets or carved into church pews, just the kind that survives. The bed is narrow, the walls are thin, there is a faint smell of onions. Someone mutters something about socks, and that is all. By the end of their lives, most medieval couples were not saints. They were not soulmates. They were not tragic lovers destined to be separated by storms and war. They were simply familiar. She knew how he shuffled his feet before sitting. He knew how she wrinkled her nose when the stew needed salt. They argued, and they forgot why. They made peace without ceremony. They shared breath and space and the quiet business of survival. Marriage was not always joyful, it was not often fair, but it was, in many cases, constant. And in a world shaped by labor and weather, that constancy was sacred in its own dull, durable way. Somewhere behind them, a raven waits in the rafters. It watches, it does not blink. But even it seems tired now. The goat naturally is asleep in the doorway. No one knows how it got there. No court recorded the small acts, the extra crust saved, the blanket adjusted in the night, the foot that found the other foot beneath the straw-stuffed mattress. No one wrote down the time they both forgot whose idea it was to plant onions, or the afternoon they both swore they would not speak again, until one of them laughed, and the silence broke like eggs on a festival morning. No parchment captured the morning routine, the shared weariness, the decision to plant the same field again because it had worked once and might again. It was not a love story. It was not a tragedy. It was two people, alive, awake, sometimes content. And that, when the winter came, when the fire dimmed, when the air held more memory than noise, that was enough. Thank you for wandering here tonight.